Indian Navy want LCA Mk2 or Advanced Medium Combat Aircraft Naval Variant, AMCA, for carrier-based fighter aircraft. Indian Navy is scouting for another carrier operations-compatible fighter besides the MiG-29, since LCA Navy lacks the payload required to be effective when operating from a carrier. DRDO, and Aeronautical Development Agency, ADA, in their efforts to develop a carrier-based fighter aircraft. On January 24, 2017, the Indian Navy went ahead and released two RFI for procurement of approximately 57 multi-role carrier-borne fighters, MRCBF, for aircraft carriers of the Indian Navy. However, speaking to the press in February 2017, Aeronautical Development Agency Director Commodore C.D. Balaji, RET, said that the Navy Chief's December remark that the LCA Navy lacked adequate payload was restricted to LCA Navy Mark I. Aeronautical Development Agency aggressive plugging of LCA Navy Mk2 suggests that the Mk2 is as capable as the MRCBF that the Navy is seeking. This is far from the truth. The extra thrust of the F414 engine would make the LCA Navy Mk2 more maneuverable but will not significantly increase its weapon load, which the Indian Navy considers inadequate. The extra thrust would come at the cost of higher fuel consumption, particularly close to max power setting, negating some of the benefits accruing from the 700-liter extra fuel that the Mk2 would carry. LCA Navy Mk2 will be a more capable air defense AD fighter than the Mk1 but will continue to lack credibility as a strike aircraft. Its range and weapon load carrying capacity would be limited even when operating from 3,000 meters runways, let alone when conducting stub-bar operations from a 200 meters carrier deck. Carrier groups are primarily strike groups, capable of delivering sustained firepower while operating at considerable distance from home shores. Typically, an aircraft carrier-borne has only one fighter type to minimize logistics and maintenance overheads. The primary role of the carrier-borne ED fighter is strike, so it must feature good weapon load and range. Since strike missions often require escort fighters and escort jammers, carrier-borne fighters must also be capable of undertaking these roles. An carrier-borne multi-role fighter allows mission planners to change the force mix, strike, escorts, jammer, based on how heavily adversary airspace is contested. The single carrier-borne aircraft type is reconfigured for its assigned task. The US FA-18, the French Rafale M, and the Chinese J-11 are examples reconfigurable, multi-role carrier-borne fighters with good weapon load and range. The Indian Navy wants a multi-role carrier-borne fighter, and the LCA Navy Mk2's credentials as a multi-role fighter are weak. It would not be a good idea to embark LCA Navy Mk2 aircraft on INS Vikramaditya or INS Vikrant alongside MiG-29KS, as Aeronautical Development Agency seems to suggest in its brochures and presentations. Having two fighter types on board would dramatically push up maintenance and logistics infrastructure requirements. More importantly, it would constrain mission planners, deprive them of the flexibility in selecting force mix. Mission force mix would become dependent on carrier-borne ED force mix. For example, when operating in uncontested airspace, LCA Navy Mk2s would have little to do. The USN does not carrier-borne two fighter types on its supercarriers capable of hosting 60 fighters. Indian Navy carriers are much smaller and carrier-borne around 20 fighters. Clearly, when drafting the RFI, the Indian Navy was visualizing Chinese carriers and nuclear submarines in the Indian Oceans, perhaps adversary beachheads on several Andaman and Nicobar Group islands. LCA Navy-equipped Indian Navy carriers aren't going to be enough to deter planned forays into the Indian Ocean, so should the Indian Navy still procure them to help India achieve self-sufficiency in arms production? Rather than pushing the LCA Navy Mk2 as the right for the Indian Navy, Aeronautical Development Agency would better serve the nation's interest by focusing on advanced medium combat aircraft development. Aeronautical Development Agency certainly doesn't have the infrastructure and talent to pursue both projects simultaneously. But Aeronautical Development Agency should continue to pursue LCA Navy as a technology demonstrator, something the Navy wants it to do. After Aeronautical Development Agency masters arrested landing, as it plans to do later this year, the agency should pursue auto landing on deck and other relevant technologies, so that when the Advanced Medium Combat Aircraft project gets a green light, Aeronautical Development Agency has all that it needs to develop the Advanced Medium Combat Aircraft naval variant.